ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live, this is Point of View. And now, Kirby Anderson.
This hour, we're going to spend some time talking about our modern culture and really the fact that we live in a world of so many different lies, and it's important for us to have an understanding. And it seems to me that sometimes we're swayed by some of these trends, some of these fads, some of these lies that are being told. And I thought it would be really important this hour to focus on a book and an individual that has really done an excellent job in this particular regard. I thought it would be very good for this first hour to go to an individual that we've talked about before, but I don't think we've ever had on the program, and that is Dr. Rosaria Butterfield, who received her Ph.D. from Ohio State University, has been known over the years as being the former professor of English and Women's Studies at Syracuse University, but also is very well known, and we've talked about her before, because of her conversion. And you, of course, are maybe familiar with her book, The Secret Thoughts of an Unlikely Convert. Of course, she also wrote another book, The Gospel Comes with a House Key. I've heard her on lots of different radio programs. Matter of fact, we're going to today talk about the new book, 5 Lies of Our Anti-Christian Age. And when I was with Jeff Shreve the other day, he had the book on his desk, and I said, oh, yes, I'm looking forward to this interview. And he said, well, I just did an interview with her, and so good. And so, again, we are excited to bring her to the conversation today. She is, again, the author of this book, 5 Lies of Our Anti-Christian Age. It is published by Crossway Books. Been out for some time, but we have information about it on the website. So, Dr. Butterfield, thank you so very much for joining us today here on Point of View.
Oh, Kirby, the pleasure is all mine. Thank you so much for having me.
Now you're listed as an author, pastor's wife, and homeschool mom, but you don't have to be very far into your book or find any story about you on various websites to know that probably the most significant reason you are known is because of a very significant conversion. And you actually start one of your chapters with that whole discussion, talking about the fact that I was not raised in a Christian home, and as a matter of fact, found yourself bristling when you went to church under the Word of God because I was a feminist lesbian. That was good. And the church and the Bible are patriarchal. That was bad. So we are talking, first of all, about, of course, a very significant conversion that you use throughout the book to talk about some of these issues.
Right. And I do that in part because I want my readers to understand my tone in this book is firm because this is the world I helped create. And although I am a believer and I have been saved by the blood of Christ, I'm also a grandmother, and if you make a mess, you need to clean it up. And so much of what we see in this world around the way that LGBTQ plus has gone way beyond just a political movement. It's the reigning idol of our day. And I used to be not only a lesbian, but a gay rights activist. And so my fingerprints are all over this. So I need to come clean and help dismantle this idol.
Well, over this next hour, we'll do our best to try to cover many of the chapters. There are, of course, 14 chapters, but they break into 5 categories. The lies: homosexuality is normal, being a spiritual person is kinder than a biblical Christian, feminism is good for the world and the church, transgenderism is normal, and modesty is an outdated burden that serves male dominance and holds women back. Let's, if we can, just get into why it certainly is significant to address this issue of homosexuality, because we live in a society today where even people inside the church oftentimes say, well, I'm not homosexual, I don't have those temptations, but I certainly need to affirm and even accept those individuals, and yet you come out talking about the fact that that's not the right strategy.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And if I could just back us up a little bit on that point, that was the reason that this book was written, is that so many other mothers and grandmothers were writing to me just that very question and saying things like, my church wants to major on the majors, but we can't even agree whether God's prohibition against homosexuality is a major. So if Christ isn't divided, why are we? How did this happen? And what am I supposed to do now? So, yes, this is the place that we need to start.
Well, and it does seem to me that if you get into, of course, any kind of scriptural perspective, whether you look at the Old Testament and Leviticus 18 and 19 or Genesis or passages, or even in Romans 1, it is unnatural. And so you take on that very important issue a little bit later, because some people will simply say, and I've had individuals say to me, look, I didn't choose this, but it seems natural and it seems appropriate. Right. And so that's exactly why if I feel that way, it must be true.
Yeah, exactly. And I think from my own experience as someone who did believe the delusion, and it was a delusion that I was a lesbian and I lived like that, it was at first very threatening, but ultimately, the most powerfully important and wonderful reality of my life, to realize that homosexuality is found in the flesh, it's forbidden in the law, and it's overcome in the Savior. And so if we deny people gospel hope, but do so in the name of compassion, at best, we're pretty confused. And at worst, we're just cowards and we're people-pleasing. So it's really serious. So yes, the idea, the idea on the streets is that if you have a sin pattern, but you didn't choose it, and then let's go the next mile, and you're not even acting on it, it's not a sin, it's a form of suffering, it's a condition. It's like being born deaf or having a club foot. But in order to say that, you have to throw away the 10th commandment, thou shalt not covet. It says thou shalt not covet. Thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's wife, and then a list of other things. It doesn't say thou shalt not take. It says covet. Covet is in the heart. And then also Romans 7, where Paul says, why do I do what I don't want to do? It is not I, but sin in me. So sin can be unchosen. Sin can be not acted on, and it is still a condemnable sin for which you are morally culpable. And as you learn to repent of sin and live in the victory of Christ, you know what happens? Satan gets tired of you, and he goes on to somebody else, and you start to experience real victory.
Let me, if I can, go to the break, but when we come back, I did want to get into some of these issues because some people wonder, again, Dr. Butterfield, how to react to this. Even in the back, you've got an afterword where you answer questions about, well, if there is a same-sex wedding, can I go to it? You have a section here on the difference between empathy and sympathy, between acceptance and affirmation. And then we'll move on to some other chapters because there are so many other issues, and maybe even have you help a little bit more, as I've tried in the past, to explain intersectionality. Since you've devoted a chapter to it, I think you probably can do a better job of explaining it than I. But if you are just joining us, we are privileged to have Dr. Butterfield with us today. We have information about her on the website, so you can go to her website and learn all more about her, maybe even have her come and speak. If you find yourself saying, well, I'd like to get a copy of this book, it has been out since September. You probably can find it in your local bookstore. It's published by our good friends at Crossway Books. But if not, we have a way in which you can get it in hardcover or paperback or Kindle. And I think you're going to find it very helpful and useful as we talk about many of the issues we discuss so often here on Point of View. And we're privileged to have her with us for the entire hour. And since many of you have, of course, heard her before, you may already have questions for her. So in a few minutes, we'll open up the phones at 1-800-351-1212 to ask a question. We'll be right back.
This is Viewpoints with Kirby Anderson.
Today is Memorial Day. For many Americans, it's merely a day off. For others, it marks the start of a summer. But hopefully for many of you, it's a time to honor those who fought for our freedom and especially for those who paid the ultimate sacrifice. Sure, we can enjoy our picnics and go for a walk and go for a swim, but we should take some time to put up a flag, make a banner, or perhaps participate in a parade honoring our military. Certainly those in the military feel more love than the vets who returned from the Vietnam War, but it wouldn't hurt to thank those who have served our country and to make them feel appreciated. We will never be able to repay them enough for their service. What else can we do? Well, if you visit a few websites, you will find all sorts of suggestions. There are a few to consider. Participate in a national moment of remembrance at 3 p.m. today. Pause, listen to taps, and reflect. I was in London's Heathrow Airport on Veterans Day. When time came to stop and reflect, the airport was absolutely quiet for a minute or so. I was impressed. We can learn something from the British and their reverence for their war dead. You might encourage your friends, your neighbors, and your family to visit cemeteries and perhaps even place flags on the graves. I've been to military cemeteries in Hawaii and the Philippines and have seen what is done there. We need to do the same back home. Those of you that live near the nation's capital might visit one of the memorials for the Vietnam veterans, World War II veterans, or the Korean War veterans. I'll let you consider what you might want to do to make this day special. The point of all of this is to make this day special. Too often we come to think about it as nothing more than a Monday holiday or a kickoff for summer. It should mean so much more for all of us. I'm Kirby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Go deeper on topics like you just heard by visiting pointofview.net. That's pointofview.net. You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, talking about the book, 5 Lies of Our Anti-Christian Age. Dr. Rosaria Butterfield with us, and we're talking about, at the moment, the issue of homosexuality, but also this gets into a later chapter on transgenderism. And it does seem to me, Dr. Butterfield, that part of the question that people that even hold to an orthodox biblical view, and as you pointed out, a lot of individuals find themselves in churches where that's being compromised today. But nevertheless, many of them are wondering, okay, I know where I stand in terms of what the Bible has to say, but I don't know how to then interact, engage in a discussion. Do I affirm? Do I accept? Do I have empathy? Do I have sympathy? Can you help us through that?
Absolutely. That is one of the key questions, and I think it's where everybody gets really tripped up. So let's back up again for just a minute and remind ourselves that we have a sin nature and that we didn't choose that sin nature, but that we're responsible for it. And because we have a Savior, we don't and we can't fix ourselves. And we also, because we have a Savior and because we can't fix ourselves, we can't fix other people. And that means that we're just not more merciful than God. So the first thing we need to do is remember that there is no such thing as a gay person. Now, I know that sounds crazy. Okay, I mean, I can hear the phone lines going. Of course, I lived as a lesbian, so I would have said, yes, during that time I was a gay person. But I mean in terms of personhood, that personhood is owned by God. It's being made in the image of God as male and female. So a woman who experiences the sin of homosexuality is still a woman. That's who she is ontologically. And a man who experiences the sin of homosexuality is still a man. So it is not who you are, and it's not who your loved one is, although it may be how that person feels. So that's the first order of business. Now, the empathy-sympathy thing is I find that to be a very important conversation right now, especially with Joe Biden's anti-bullying legislation in every federally mandated in all government schools that is just wreaking havoc among young people because of the particular way that anti-bullying is defined. In some ways, it's defined as, can you empathize? Can you stand in the shoes of this person who calls himself transgender? And the problem with that is that doesn't help anybody. If I'm drowning in the river, Kirby, please don't stand in my shoes. Stay on solid ground and throw me a rope. And that's what the gospel does. But we live in a hypertherapy world, a world that believes that feelings are insurmountable and that feelings tell the truth of who people are. And that's just not true. God is insurmountable, and God tells the truth of who people are. And so for those of us who have been liberated from the LGBTQ plus idolatrous movement, we can tell you that there is victory in Christ, and there is hope in Christ, and there is hopelessness in this kind of, therapy narrative of empathy, and it's not compassion. And I know most of our listeners probably already know what, Pastor Alistair Begg said recently. It's very, maybe we'll get into that, maybe we won't. And, we all love Alistair. We've all learned from him. But that was a blunder. That was a sin. And it's just not true. It is not compassion to put millstones around the necks of people like the person I used to be. And I'd really appreciate it if people wouldn't do that and call it love.
Yes. Again, speaking the truth in love is a biblical principle, and that is the case. And one of the things, this kind of leads into your chapter on intersectionality. As many of our listeners know, I used to spend lots of years speaking on college campuses as a guest speaker, and I would work really hard to use inclusive language so it wouldn't offend a feminist. I would try to use various kinds of ways to not cause any more affront. But you tell an interesting story of being on a college campus in which you were talking about back in, I suspect, 1998, when it was close to your conversion, where you were starting to believe the gospel, but you talked about your transgender friend putting her large hands on top of you, and immediately you get criticized as being homophobic, transphobic, because you said she had large hands. Now, that one would not have occurred to me that would be offensive to individuals, but it illustrates only so well, if you want to tell the rest of the story, how today it's almost impossible to have just an honest, gracious conversation because these micro comments, these microaggressions are everywhere these days.
Yeah, but I'll tell you, that was great. That was great training grounds for what I do these days, which is go to my local school board and speak on the subject of parental rights and the junk science of transgenderism. So those little dust-ups on college campuses were helpful. So student pops up and says, "Look, you called your transgender friend's hands large, and that is transphobic." Sometimes these Q&As on college campuses happen, post my bedtime. I'm exhausted. My feet hurt. I have to ask people, would you just explain yourself a little bit, please? And so I said that to the student, and the student said, well, everybody knows that quote unquote transgender women and a quote unquote transgender woman would be a biological man. So everybody knows that transgender women are offended at the thought that their hands are large. And I said, but large is, it's a descriptive adjective. It's just objective. I'm 5 feet tall. My hands don't even span an octave. Anybody's hands are larger than mine. It's just the truth, I said. And the student said something that was just transformative. The student says, well, that's what leads LGBTQ plus people to suicide. I said, but that's ridiculous. The size of my friend's hands is objective truth. And the student looked at me and said something that really made me realize just what an illness of intellectual, perversion is going on college campuses. The student says, who cares about your truth? Your truth isn't my truth. Your truth hates my reality. Mm-hmm. And,
wow.
There are lots of times, not just on college campuses, but at school board meetings, there are a lot of times when I realize a situation requires this old-fashioned thing called let's sit down and talk about this over dinner. Let's get out of here and let's go, in that case, let's go to the pastor's office let's go to the vice president's office, or when I'm in a school board meeting, can you come over for dinner, or could I meet you at a coffee shop? Because there's a level of simply paranoid delusion that goes into this. And basically, intersectionality is the idea that goes like this. There is no truth. All there is power. And anyone with power is a dangerous person, even if that person has the authority to have that power. And therefore, the world will be a better place if we reallocate power. And it is, as I said, it's just it's impossible to work, to talk somebody off that ledge in a public setting. And here's the reason. So much of the LGBTQ plus movement depends on a public setting. That's what affirmation is. The Obergefell decision, the 2015 Supreme Court decision, had something in it called the dignitary harm clause. It redefined legal harm to mean you are harming someone if you fail to affirm their LGBTQ plus dignity. And so with all of this public fanfare, public affirmation, it's so important as a Christian to find ways to meet with people in this old-fashioned place called private. No tweeting, no blogging, no recording, just one image bearer of a holy God trying to put the hand of, yet another image bearer of a holy God who is under a delusion into the hands of the Savior. And I think if we would get better at that, we would stop fooling ourselves into thinking that it's compassionate to go to gay weddings, or it's compassionate to basically just negotiate the terms of our surrender. That is not what God's calling anybody to do. And it's not helpful. It's not helpful to your loved ones, and it's certainly not helpful to the witness of Christ.
Well said. We need to take a break. We're talking about the 5 lies of our anti-Christian age. Since we did mention transgenderism, we'll come back and spend some time, jump ahead to one of the chapters there. We've had, of course, Abigail Schreier on here. We've talked about Lisa Littman. We've talked about some of this idea of transgenderism, but that is one of the chapters in this book, along with other chapters, which we will get to as well. If you find yourself saying, I really would like to read this book, it is available in your bookstore, but we also have a lot of information that you can find in terms of Dr. Butterfield's website. We also, of course, have information, so if you'd like to order it in paperback, hardback, Kindle, it's all available there as well. Let's take a break. We will continue our conversation on 5 lies of our anti-Christian age right after this.
In 19th century London, 2 towering historical figures did battle, not with guns and bombs, but words and ideas. London was home to Karl Marx, the father of communism, and legendary Baptist preacher Charles Spurgeon. London was in many ways the center of the world, economically, militarily, and intellectually. Marx sought to destroy religion, the family, and everything the Bible supports. Spurgeon stood against him, warning of socialism's dangers. Spurgeon understood Christianity is not just religious truth, it is truth for all of life. Where do you find men with that kind of wisdom to stand against darkness today? Get the light you need on today's most pressing issues delivered to your inbox when you sign up for the Viewpoints commentary at pointofview.net/signup. Every weekday, in less than 2 minutes, you'll learn how to be a person of light to stand against darkness in our time. It's free, so visit pointofview.net/signup right now. pointofview.net/signup. Point of View will continue after this. You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, is Kirby Anderson.
Continue our conversation today with Dr. Rosario Butterfield as we talk about 5 lies of our anti-Christian age. And I thought for just a minute we would at least dip into the issue of transgenderism since you mentioned that.
Yep.
But I love the way you put it out. You say, I've got a 1973 Oxford English dictionary on my desk, and guess what? That word doesn't even appear there. And we've said that since this program has been going on since 1972, I think I could also say that when Marlon Maddox started Point of View more than 50 years ago, we didn't think we'd be talking about things like transgenderism. But one of the things I love most about your books and writing is you think about things in a new way, and you have a chapter where you refer to that as the sin of envy. And I never really thought about that before. So let me let you start there, because that is another way to think about this issue of transgenderism, isn't it?
Right. Yeah, it is, but we have to back up just a little bit, because another word that isn't in the OED on my desk from 73 is the word gender, used in the way we describe it today. So the whole transgender movement works on a feminist principle that biological sex and cultural gender are two different things, and the Bible condones that. And that just, first of all, is not true. I mean, you could say they're two separate things insofar as, you can parse that in this world. But biblically speaking, there is no difference between sex and gender, and that is because God made the pattern of sexual difference, male and female, for the purpose of procreation, which is heterosexuality. And we also know from Genesis 1 that male and female are not only ontological, that is, you are made in the image of God as a man or as a woman, but also eternal, that you will be the man that you were meant to be, or the woman you were meant to be, that God made you to be, in heaven or hell and the New Jerusalem. So that's very serious. But what transgenderism believes, it takes that feminist distinction between sex and gender, and it just gets rid of sex entirely, and it introduces gender as a new category of personhood, separate from the biological category of sex. And we know that that is unnatural to the created order and harmful for the purposes for which God made us. So homosexuality and transgenderism are alike in this one way. They both are attacks and rebellion against the created order. But they kind of pitch their tent in two different places. So with transgenderism, you have a lot of vocabulary, as you said. I mean, so much so that supposedly there are 78 gender pronouns right now, and probably by the time you and I hang up the phone, there will be 1,000.
Yes.
Okay, because that's how crazy it is. It's impossible. But there are two ways that we predominantly talk about transgenderism. One is a medical diagnosis of gender dysphoria, and that is the medical analog is anorexia. Someone with a body dysphoria is someone who has an irrational and delusional understanding of their own body. Now, no one would say to an anorexic girl, hey, you just need a sticker in a parade, and maybe you should get liposuction, and you're right, you're fat. Nobody would say that. That would be criminal. And yet, that's what we do with this category, this dysphoric category of gender dysphoria. But the more common issue is the ideology of transgenderism, which we are really seeing coming out of the government schools right now, in part because of Biden's anti-bullying legislation, which requires, and think about this, think about a 12-year-old girl who doesn't like her body, and in order to not be a bully, she needs to be an ally to a transgender person, whatever that means. And so it is really quite ideological, and it tells young people, if there's a war between your body and your mind, your body can go, and you can transform it, and you can have everything you want. And I would strongly recommend a recent podcast by Brandon Showalter called Generation Indoctrination. It really hits this point hard, and your listeners will benefit from letting Brandon Showalter do the heavy lifting, and so you don't have to. But yeah, really serious. And And I remember back on my college campus days meeting a number of students who would try to keep me off campus and, she's transphobic. And I'll sit down with this, with a girl, and I'll say, what's the problem? She'll say, well, I'm really a boy, and, you're not using my pronouns, and da-da-da-da-da. And and I'll say, well, why do you think you're a boy? Well, I feel it in my feelings. I say, okay, so there's a war between what your body says and what your feelings say. Yes. Why do you want to change your body? Why not start by trying to change your feelings? And often students would say to me, you mean I can do that? Okay, like seriously. Wait, full stop, Rosaria. You mean you can? Yes, absolutely. Let's go find a biblical counselor right now. Let's deal with this. Yes, you can. Yes, you must, because you are made in the image of God as a woman. And you can give all kinds of cosmetic surgery, but you can't change it. But what you see is the world we live in is a world that is highly given to envy and to covetousness. If you want it, you must obviously need it, because your feelings could never deceive you, says our lying world. And so, we know that envy, the Bible has very strong things to say about envy. It's connected to covetousness. It's fiercer than wrath. It's rottenness to the bones, which is almost a poetic description of transgenderism, where the use of cross-sex hormones usually bleaches your body from the bone marrow that you need. The last time I spoke at the local school board, which was last month, my 21-year-old son, who attends a public university, who comes with me as my bodyguard, said, Mom, did you notice that all of the people taking cross-sex hormones are now walking with walkers and canes? And it's like that on my campus, too.
Yes.
And then because he's a Christian, he also reminded me, and this is the world that Jesus came to save. And so we need to remember those. Envy is not solved by giving into it. You don't fix a person's envy. And that's part of why you see the monetization of transgenderism and the exploitation of it on the part of big pharma. If you have a 12-year-old girl who takes her first hit of testosterone and she's hooked, you have a medical patient for life. And don't tell me big pharma isn't looking at the dollar signs of that.
And we've seen some great stories about that from people that have honestly said that from podiums and things of that nature.
Yes, and detransitioners. But what makes me very concerned is part of why we are where we are is because the church didn't have the courage and the conviction to say, no, it's the sin of envy. It's a sin. You're not a transgender Christian. You can't be made in the image of God and uphold, the world, the flesh, and the devil. You're made in the image of God in the knowledge, righteousness, and holiness. Now, you're a human being, so you are made in the image of God. And therefore, we want you to grow in the knowledge, righteousness, and holiness of Jesus, which you do by repenting of the envy and getting the help that you need. No one is suggesting that you shouldn't get counseling or comfort, but comfort is not going to be found in what they call transitioning, whether it's social, hormonal, or surgical. That is Gothic. My husband is a pastor. He preached 3 sermons on the sin of transgenderism. And one of my favorite lines from Kent's sermons is when he said, it's like Dr. Frankenstein met Dr. Mengele, and they decided to go into business together. And, seriously now, no Christian should support that. And yet that is exactly the reason we are right where we are, is because we caved on the gay issue. And we said, oh, sure, you can be a gay Christian. Oh, you can be a gay Christian. Just do this, that, or the, just work it off in this way, that way, that way. And so we caved there. And now we are in this place where major parachurch ministries have embraced what's called a side B or a revoice gay Christian paradigm. And we're just extending it to transgenderism. And what is horrible about this is we have brave detransitioners, people who have gone all the way through this, come to Christ, realize they were wrong, clawing their way back, trying to say to the church, don't let anyone else do this. don't be okay with this. You need to be in Jude 23 posture, saving someone as though in a fire, not acting as though this is a small matter. This is huge. And again, I can't think of a population that more needs the gospel than the population who believes that they are transgender or their parents. If you met some of the people I've met at school boards, I'm talking school board meetings, I'm talking about the man who castrated his 14-year-old son because he thought it was a good idea. That man needs the gospel, as does his son.
We'll take a break and continue our conversation right after this.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes. Again, the book is 5 Lies of Our Anti-Christian Age. And again, Dr. Rosario Butterfield with us. And Dr. Butterfield, you'd mentioned Frankenstein. It made me smile because I know that your doctoral dissertation was on Mary Shelley, the teenage author of Frankenstein. But more importantly, I want to get to the idea of feminism because Mary Wollstonecraft is, of course, one of the founders, maybe the founder of feminism. And that, in some respects, was one of your great heroes. But obviously now you have some things that you want to say about how to think about feminism from a Christian point of view.
That's right. That's right. Well, the book 5 Lies of Our Anti-Christian Age talks about these as lies because they are lies. But, you know, like most lies, there's a kind of half-truth to it
Sure.
that makes it very, I don't compelling and maybe even seductive. But yes, I lived as a feminist. I was raised by a feminist. I was in a family where if the name Planned Parenthood came up, everybody would sigh a great sigh of relief because it was proof that we weren't some kind of third world country. I'm serious. I'm not kidding. And so when I became a Christian, I had to look at everything, almost like I had to take all the file folders of my brain and dump them out on the floor of the office and just figure out, is there anything, Lord? Is there anything I get to keep? But what happened when I examined my feminist beliefs against the pages of Scripture was simply this. If you trust that God knows what he's doing when he created woman, then you do not need to add feminism to the gospel. The gospel does not need a feminist rescue. God is not some kind of crazy engineer who builds a bridge that falls into a river. God builds a bridge to a perfect place. And when God made woman and gave her the creational capacity to bear children and nurture them, that necessarily meant that he valued highly what it means to be a caregiver. And when God established the order of the family that we see in Ephesians and other places, he did not do that to hurt or women or to deny that we have intelligence or capacity, but merely to say, and this is your lane. This is your lane. And you don't need somebody to defend you from living happily in this lane. And so that book, Five Lies of Our Anti-Christian Age, I wrote it in part because I'm a teacher. And it seems like our younger people today are terrified about biblical marriage.
Yes.
Even 10 years ago, many of my students would say, I'd say, what do you want to be? I want to be a housewife. I want to bear children. I want to be the wife of a godly husband, and I want to raise my children. I want to homeschool them. And even now I'm having people who are much older than my students. I teach high school literature. So much older than my students, maybe even 10 years older, saying things like, I don't know, maybe being single is better than being married. And here's what I can tell you. A world that grows in its homosexuality, transgenderism, and singleness is a world that is not being blessed by God. And so feminism declares that there is a difference between sex and gender. And yes, in terms of your biological sex, you are, as a woman, have the capacity to bear children. But, maybe you want to be an astronaut. How are you going to do that? So it really, so what I'm saying is that it implies that somehow living according to the paradigm and even in the lane that God has given us, that somehow that means you're missing out. And just the opposite is true. Because what we've done is we've taken a whole generation of women and we've said, don't get married, don't have children. And then often they're 40 and they say, hey, I think I'm missing out on something. And it's often a little bit late at that point to start a family. So feminism is not rescuing the Bible. It's not rescuing the gospel. It's often creating a kind of envy that is very unhelpful. That what we need are Christian men and women who take seriously their creational design and the gospel power of that, who love the Bible, who believe every word of it to be true, and who are not tempted by the glitter and the false promises of the world. In some ways, I've had the opportunity to live. I'm like a cat. I've lived many lives here. Mm-hmm. And I will tell you that there has not been one day home with my children. I've homeschooled. I have 4 children. I've had a chance to homeschool them. I have a grandson. There is not one day at home, even the worst day at home, is better than any day I've spent in, the power of a university. And that is because living out my creational design is peaceful and it's safe and it's rewarding,
fulfilling,
and fulfilling, and it's what God has called me to do. So, so I would just say that it seems very strange to me. I think that the rise of feminism, the rise of transgenderism, the rise of homosexuality, the rise of singleness are all things that share in this idea that sex and gender are different, and that you basically get to just make your own party. You get to determine these things. And, we can trust that God creates patterns for a purpose. And also that growing in contentment with what God has called us to do is part of our godliness. That godliness with contentment is great gain. And it is a beautiful thing.
Yes.
And so I think we need more Titus II women who are just willing to come up alongside of young women and say, look, get a grip, okay? Get a grip. And it's going to be okay.
Titus II.
Desire good things.
Let me just mention, just before I run out of time, that you do have a study guide. And so if you find yourself saying, I'd like to dive deeper into some of the key points, and there's questions and discussion and Bible verses, there's a whole section, there's an afterword. And really, you've designed this for anybody to read, but especially for women. But this would be just a great small group Bible study. But I would also say to pastors, some of these issues, I think you should preach from the pulpit as well, to really address the lies of our anti-Christian age. So I appreciate you not only writing the book, but thank you for giving us an entire hour to talk about. And turns out only 3 of the 5 chapters, but we did a pretty good job of covering at least some of the material that you have posted, and that would make people want to go and get a copy of the book and learn more.
Well, thank you, Kirby, and thank you for what you do. We need truth to be proclaimed from the mountaintops, and that's what you all do. So thank you for that. It's a real pleasure to be with you and to have this conversation.
Well, I've been following you for some time, and we've mentioned you from time to time, but I think this may be the first time we've had you on the program, but maybe we can do that again. But in case you didn't catch all of this, we have, first of all, the information about the book, 5 Lies of Our Anti-Christian Age. It is published by Crossway Books. Look for it in your local bookstore, but if you can't find it, we do have information about that on the website. You can get it in hardback. Now I believe it's in paperback, and of course it's in Kindle. If you'd like to contact her, maybe you'd like to have Rosaria Butterfield speak. Well, you don't even have to know how to spell her name, but it's rosariabutterfield.com. That is on the website as well, and you can find all the information you need at pointofview.net. Again, this is a very important issue, and if you'd like to know more, of course, you can go to the website, which is pointofview.net. Well, hope you enjoyed the interview because, again, this is a very important issue, and if you'd like to know more, of course, you can go to the website, which is pointofview.net. Find out more about the book, 5 Lies of Our Anti-Christian Age. You can find out more about her. We'll be back with you right after this.
It was not that long ago that censorship appeared to be almost inevitable. Free speech was being attacked and strangled in many places. And some of us wondered if this was the end. But now, many feel a new sense of hope, a chance for a fresh dawn. Let me caution you, now is not the time to relax. It's a time to press forward, to use this fresh opportunity to proclaim and learn how to apply truth to current issues. By the fact you're here, listening right now, that tells me that you recognize the vital role Point of View plays as a voice of truth. For more than 50 years, we've informed and equipped people who have made a real difference. And when you give to Point of View today, you breathe life into what can be a new golden era for the truth. Please, take a moment right now and invest in truth. Visit pointofview.net or give it 1-800-347-5151. That's pointofview.net. Click in now or call 1-800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
I do appreciate Point of View and what you folks are doing. You really are doing a great job to educate and to help Christian folks do a better job to honor Christ in all that we do.
My husband and I are your supporters. We just really appreciate the show and the people you bring on.
I just want to commend you guys on your program. I love listening to you.
It's a blessing. Been listening to you for several years. Your program has helped my family see current events and elections and politics through the eyes and the principles of Scripture. And that's been enlightening, and we're trying to pass that on to others.
I want to say, first of all, that I really enjoyed the Millennial Roundtable, and I love the program altogether. I think Kirby is great, and I really appreciate all of y'all, all that y'all do, and the truth that y'all put out.
Hey, great show. Love all your comments and what you're talking about.
Thanks again for what you do.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kirby Anderson. Each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kirby Anderson.
This hour we're going to talk about dinosaurs, and we're going to try to answer some of the questions that maybe you have had, or maybe questions that your children or grandchildren have asked of you, and I think this is going to be a great forum for that. If you've ever been involved in youth ministry, these are topics, dinosaurs and the related topics to them, which are very significant, and whenever I would speak sometimes for various camps, whether it was at Pine Cove or Sky Ranch or Mount Hermon, whatever it might be, if I were to offer, and many times would, an alternative suggestion or optional session in which we would talk about dinosaurs and bring out for the kids all the models of dinosaurs, it was always well attended, a lot of enthusiasm, but also a lot of questions. And so I think that this particular book that came out last year through Answers in Genesis is an attempt to begin to answer those questions that maybe you have. Dinosaurs, Dragons, and the Bible, and it is written by Bodie Hodge, who is a speaker, writer, and researcher for Answers in Genesis, has his master's degree from Southern Illinois University. He has been involved in many books and DVDs through Answers in Genesis, and is a regular speaker at their Creation Museum Speaker Series. So, Bodie, welcome back to Point of View.
Hey, it's great to be back on the show.
Let's begin talk about why you wrote the book. That first chapter is why that's important. And I'll have to say that it's so important, first of all, for the kids, because if they're in grade school, they almost always are just fascinated by the dinosaurs. And as I've said, there are all sorts of opportunities to have maybe an alternative session or an optional session, bring out some of these dinosaur models, and they're really excited. I've been through various creation museums as well as evolutionary museums, and the place where the kids stop most often and spend the most time is with the dinosaur fossils and reconstruction. So in some respects, this book was necessary, if for no other reason than it's a really hot topic even to this day.
Oh, yeah, it absolutely is. In fact, that's why we put the book together. A lot of people have questions. The kids love it, but you know what? Here's what I found. The adults standing there with them, they love it just as much. So they love dealing with the subject of dinosaurs. And you're right, people have a lot of questions about dinosaurs, and they're very sincere questions. I mean, sometimes the kids ask some of the most brilliant questions you can imagine, and then once the kids start asking the parents, they chime in and go, hey, I got a question. So that's what this book is. This book answers a lot of those top questions people have about dinosaurs in the Bible and how that all relates. So it really is a neat subject.
Again, Master's books, 25 chapters and a lot of subsections in there. And let's explain why this would be important, because oftentimes I am addressing this issue. Matter of fact, each year in the fall, I teach creationism at a Bible school, and I oftentimes get the question. Matter of fact, by the second session, I start answering the questions about dinosaurs, because if you are maybe a theistic evolutionist, well, okay, I know where I put the dinosaurs. If you're even a progressive old Earth creationist, you can say, well, maybe they were created in the past. But if you're a young Earth creationist, and that is certainly the view of Answers in Genesis, you've got a lot more questions. Did God create the dinosaurs? Were the dinosaurs on the ark? What happened to the dinosaurs? Is there any relationship between dinosaurs and dragons? Are dinosaurs in the Bible? There are some really important questions, and that's especially why you wrote this, because in some respects, those are questions that surface, especially if you believe in young Earth creationism.
Yeah, exactly right. We've been influenced by the secular world, and we need to step back and recognize the entire Western world has. In fact, people all around the world, even not in the Western world, are being influenced by secular views. And with that comes a lot of baggage, this evolutionary concept, separating out man and certain animals by long ages. And, so when we go back and we say, hey, we believe the Bible, and the Bible says God created everything in 6 days, well, now all of a sudden you got to defend that view because a lot of people have never heard of it or they don't know how to think about it. For example, when we look at dinosaurs, man was created on the sixth day of creation, so were land animals. And look at that. Dinosaurs, by their actual definition, are land animals. They have one of two hip structures, by the way. And for those of you who are wondering how a dinosaur is defined, that's what it is. It's based on their hips. They're a reptilian land creature where their legs are under their body, so they stand up. So it's not like a crocodile or Komodo dragon, but they're a land animal. That's the point. So man and dinosaurs were indeed living at the same time. Like you said, questions start popping up right then. But that shows they have an interest in the subject. They want to understand it from a biblical viewpoint. And that's why it's so important to get these answers into their hands.
By the way, you do give us a little bit more information about the two different kind of pelvis in dinosaurs. And when I was in graduate school taking vertebrate paleontology, we had to learn all that. But let's move away from the secular view and really establish, just before we take a break, the basics of a biblical worldview. And that is best summarized by what you call the 7 C's of history. Because once you understand that, at least you understand the framework you're using to begin to talk about dinosaurs. Anybody that has been following the ministry of Answers in Genesis or been to the Creation Museum or the Ark Encounter probably knows that. But let's, if we can, go through, if you will, the 7 C's of history, because that's really key to what you're going to be using as your grid and your framework to look at dinosaurs.
Right. Yeah. See, people hear that term 7 C's, like, well, what is that? Don't let it scare you. They're just milestones throughout the Bible. And they all start with the letter C. It's kind of like when you go to church and you hear a pastor and everything starts with the same letter. We do the same thing. So you have creation. That's the very first C. Then you have the corruption, when the world went from a perfect state to an imperfect and broken state. Then you have the catastrophe, the flood of Noah's day, which explains most of the rock layers that contain fossils. Of course, we've had fossil layers since that time, but most are from the flood. Then we have the fourth C, that confusion at the Tower of Babel, or Babel. Well, that just goes to show the effects are still in. And then we have Christ, his work on the cross, and then we look forward to a final consummation. So what that is the Bible in a nutshell, just with these different C's. And what we like to do is step back and say, okay, let's use these different milestones throughout history to look at dinosaurs. So when we look at dinosaurs, what day were they created? How were they created? They were actually created perfectly. That's what we expected from a perfect God, was a perfect creation. There was no death, no bloodshed, no suffering. Deuteronomy 32:4 says every work of God is perfect. And so we expected the work of creation to be perfect. And at the end of the creation week, God declared everything very good. It really was perfect. But all that changed. And that brings us to the second C of history, the corruption. When Adam and Eve, our mutual ancestors, when they rebelled against God, elevated their own thoughts to supersede what God had said about a particular fruit, they ate from that fruit. God cursed the ground. He cursed the animals, and he sentenced man to die. The world went from a perfect state to an imperfect and broken state. And that's the world we live in now. But think of dinosaurs in that.
Yes.
The animals were cursed. That includes the dinosaurs. So, yeah.
Let's take a break, and when we come back, we will get into some of those questions. Okay, when did God make the dinosaurs, the pterosaurs, the plesiosaurs? What did dinosaurs eat? A question I always get, were dinosaurs on the ark, or did they go extinct before the flood? And is there any evidence of dinosaurs after the flood? And how could you have even fit all the dinosaurs on the ark? And are dinosaurs and dragons the same thing? And all those kinds of really important questions that we receive. That is all part of the conversation we're going to have today as we talk about the book, Dinosaurs, Dragons, and the Bible, and we'll continue our conversation with Bodie Hodge right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kirby Anderson.
Today is Memorial Day. For many Americans, it's merely a day off. For others, it marks the start of a summer. But hopefully for many of you, it's a time to honor those who fought for our freedom and especially for those who paid the ultimate sacrifice. Sure, we can enjoy our picnics and go for a walk and go for a swim, but we should take some time to put up a flag, make a banner, or perhaps participate in a parade honoring our military. Certainly those in the military feel more love than the vets who returned from the Vietnam War, but it wouldn't hurt to thank those who have served our country and to make them feel appreciated. We will never be able to repay them enough for their service. What else can we do? Well, if you visit a few websites, you will find all sorts of suggestions. There are a few to consider. Participate in a national moment of remembrance at 3 p.m. today. Pause, listen to taps, and reflect. I was in London's Heathrow Airport on Veterans Day. When time came to stop and reflect, the airport was absolutely quiet for a minute or so. I was impressed. We can learn something from the British and their reverence for their war dead. You might encourage your friends, your neighbors, and your family to visit cemeteries and perhaps even place flags on the graves. I've been to military cemeteries in Hawaii and the Philippines and have seen what is done there. We need to do the same back home. Those of you that live near the nation's capital might visit one of the memorials for the Vietnam veterans, World War II veterans, or the Korean War veterans. I'll let you consider what you might want to do to make this day special. The point of all of this is to make this day special. Too often we come to think about it as nothing more than a Monday holiday or a kickoff for summer. It should mean so much more for all of us. I'm Kirby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Go deeper on topics like you just heard by visiting pointofview.net. That's pointofview.net. You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Look, today we're talking about dinosaurs, dragons, and the Bible, and we're going to get into some of the evidence that would suggest maybe dinosaurs didn't live so long ago after all, but we'll get to that later, because right now we want to just try to kind of set forth the case and then begin to defend it. And one of the things that we would obviously have to start with, Bodie Hodge, is to really talk about, well, when did God make dinosaurs and plesiosaurs and pterosaurs? That's chapter 6. Pretty straightforward. You've already said that, but again, part of that has to do with taking the Bible seriously.
That's right. When we look back at creation, God created things on different days. The land animals, which would be the land dinosaurs, that is, they would have been made on the sixth day. I already mentioned that. But when you think of the pterosaurs and the plesiosaurs, hold it. Now all of a sudden you got some flying reptiles, you got some sea reptiles. Now, by technical definition, they're actually not considered dinosaurs. Now, I know in a layman's sense we sometimes want to lump them in with the dinosaurs, but technically they're not by definition. But what day would they have been created? Actually, if we look carefully on the days of creation, it would have been the fifth day. The fifth day when the flying creatures as well as the sea creatures both came into existence. God created them on those particular days. So you have dinosaurs on day 6, but you have those pterosaurs and those plesiosaurs, as well as other flying or water reptiles would have been made on day 5. So that's what I want people to do. I want them to think, go back, hey, let's take the Bible seriously. Now let's look at these subjects.
Wow. You know, one of your chapters is, what did dinosaurs originally eat? Now, if you've ever watched Jurassic Park or Jurassic World or a variety of other dinosaur movies, of course, most of the time they tend to focus on a lot of the carnivorous dinosaurs. But what about that? Because if you're indeed believing that God made the world and it was good, it was good, it was very good, it makes you wonder about whether or not you had those dinosaurs, if indeed they were created on the fifth and sixth days, whether they were eating meat. What's your thoughts?
Yeah, well, originally they would have been vegetarian. And the reason we know that is also at the end of the creation week, God said that these animals were eating a plant-based diet. They were eating green herbs. And that's what we expect from a God of life. He made a world full of life, not a world full of death. We need to understand where death came from. Death is actually a punishment. It is a punishment for sin. So when Adam and Eve sinned against God, that's when death first came into the world. In fact, we see a relationship there between man and the animals. When Adam and Eve sinned against God, God sacrificed animals right there in the Garden of Eden to make coats of skins for Adam and his wife. In fact, we still mimic that today by wearing clothing. But that was the first recorded death of anything as a direct result of human sin. So there is a relationship between man's sin and animal death. So no dinosaurs could have died until after that. Therefore, none of the dinosaurs were eating meat before that because that requires death. So when we look at that biblically, we go, oh, hold on a second here then. These animals were not eating meat originally. They were originally vegetarian. It wasn't until after sin that they could first start eating meat. Now, some of them did start to eat meat. We do know that. And the reason we know that third C of history is the catastrophe, the flood of Noah's day. And we see all these different dinosaurs that are buried in these rock layers that are actually from the flood of Noah's day. They're not millions and billions of years old. These are from the flood of Noah's day. Noah and the animals are floating around in the ark up above them while these rock layers are being laid down. Now, as we've been sifting through those different rock layers, we find rock layers like Cretaceous, Jurassic, and Triassic, and they have dinosaurs in them. And in some cases, we find where some of these dinosaurs had eaten other dinosaurs. We actually find their stomach contents fossilized in there. So at some point, they did start to eat meat. It was after Adam and Eve sinned against God. But we see that in that snapshot at the flood of Noah's day.
Now, as soon as you bring that up, then some people say, okay, wait a minute. We do see these dinosaurs or related reptiles that have teeth, and they sharp teeth, claws, and what about that? Because after all, that usually is what you would expect from a meat eater. So how do you respond to that?
Yeah, these are called defense or attack structures. Now, those things are very handy in a sin, cursed, and broken world. But see, we have the mindset of thinking, oh, wow, claws are bad, teeth are bad, but not necessarily. I grew up in the western part of Illinois, and one of the things that we have a lot of are squirrels. Squirrels are beautiful little creatures, but they have some pretty vicious claws, and they also have some pretty sharp teeth. People don't realize that I actually got bit by a squirrel once. But what do they use their claws for? Well, for climbing trees and holding nuts. What do they use their teeth for? For ripping through nuts and getting through that sort of thing. So they're not using them for any harsh purpose. In our minds, we've been taught, oh, sharp teeth, claws, those things are evidence of meat eating, but that's not necessarily the case. So when we look at these defense and attack structures, there's actually two different biblical viewpoints that pop out. One is that those particular features were simply utilized for a different purpose, whether it's climbing trees or holding nuts and so forth. Imagine some of these big dinosaurs ripping right through some hard coconuts and so forth. They need some sharp teeth or hard teeth to be able to deal with that. The other viewpoint is there may have been some design changes at the fall of man. When Adam and Eve sinned, God cursed the ground. He cursed the animals, and there were physical changes. That serpent that was involved, being influenced by Satan to deceive the woman, that serpent was cursed to crawl on its belly and eat dust all the days of its life. Most commentators think that serpent physically changed forms to be at a lower position, so there was a physical change going on there. If you look at the parallel to the plants, when God cursed the ground, certain plants gave rise to thorns and thistles. So that was a physical change. Was this when sharp teeth, claws came about to help them survive in a sin-cursed world? It's possible. So we'd leave either of those options open, but either way, when we start with the Bible, it makes sense of things like claws and teeth and even turtle shells and things like to help protect themselves from being eaten. Yeah.
Well, and let's, if we can, get to the question a lot of people have, and it's one you've heard before. I mean, you opened the Ark encounter back in 2016, so this is not the first time you've heard that question. It will not be the last, and that is, were dinosaurs on Noah's Ark? Or, and I think there's not an either or because it could be both and, did any of them maybe even go extinct before the flood? Your thoughts?
Well, I don't know if any of them actually went extinct. The Bible says that two of every kind did come on board the ark, though it is possible, but I would probably say most likely their kinds had not gone extinct by that particular time. Now, as for being on board the ark, yeah, they came on board the ark. That is a representative. Two of each kind was on board Noah's ark. So these animals, they came on the ark in their pairs. They came off of the ark, and they've been dying out ever since then. So, yeah, these dinosaurs were definitely on the ark. And it's funny, when I'm speaking, I got two types of people in my audiences. When I say, hey, do you guys think dinosaurs were in the ark? I have some people that just sit there like, what? Huh? And then I have a whole bunch of people that shout out, yes! And I'm like, have you guys walked through the ark or the museum already? And they're like, yes! And I'm like, okay, that's like studying for the test.
Yes.
So, they do kind of know, because when you walk through the ark, you get to see some of these dinosaurs. Now, of course, I have people say, as a related question, how'd you fit those big dinosaurs on that little bathtub ark? Now, those who've been to the Ark Encounter, they realize Noah's Ark was not a little bathtub ark. It was a gigantic vessel. The second thing is, why would Noah take the great, big, huge dinosaurs on board the ark? It makes more sense that God brought the smaller ones, the juveniles. They can live on their own, less food, less space, less waste, better breeding stock when they come off the ark. So most likely they took the smaller ones. And these animals would have easily fit on board Noah's Ark. That wasn't really a problem at all.
And again, you talk about that in one of your chapters, but when we come back from the break, just for a minute, it is a good way to also feature the Ark Encounter, because it's a very important question that you address in your book. How many kinds of animals, including dinosaurs, were on the Ark? And the key word there is kinds, and how that means. And then, of course, did you have enough for at least the air-breathing land animals? Did you have enough room for their food? And in some cases, you're talking about hay, pellets, you're talking about fruit and vegetables. You don't have to necessarily deal with as many of the winged creatures or sea creatures or any of them, actually. And so that's, I think, something we might want to talk about, just simply because if you've never been to the Ark Encounter, you don't realize how big it is. And then when we come back afterwards, we'll not only talk about that, but, okay, what happened to the dinosaurs after, first of all, during the flood and then after the flood. And then we get into the other part of your chapter and title, Are Dinosaurs and Dragons the Same Thing? And we'll talk about some of the ways in which the words have been changed in the Bible. And then, okay, if indeed you believe that there were dinosaurs, did the dinosaurs ever get mentioned in the Bible? And you might want to turn ahead to the book of Job. We'll get into that. And so just a lot more to cover with Bodie Hodge. The book is entitled Dinosaurs, Dragons, and the Bible. Of course, you can get that through Answers in Genesis. We have information about that organization on our website. We have information about the book. Came out last year. Might even be able to find it in your local bookstore. So there are some resources. And if you have some young ones, could be children or grandchildren, asking questions, this is one that either they could read, or if they're too young, you could read to them, and I guarantee you they'd be interested. Let's take a break. We'll continue our conversation right after this.
The Bible tells us not to worry, and yet there is a lot of worrying stuff in our world today. Thankfully, the Bible doesn't stop at telling us not to worry. God gives us a next step. He says we need to pray. But sometimes even knowing what to pray can be difficult, and that is why Point of View has relaunched our Pray for America movement, a series of weekly emails to guide you in prayer for our nation. Each week you'll receive a brief update about a current issue affecting Americans, along with a written prayer that you can easily share with others. We'll also include a short free resource for you in each email so you can learn more about the issue at hand. Will you commit to pray for America? Go to pointofview.net. Click on the Pray for America banner at the top of the page to subscribe. Again, that's pointofview.net. Click on the Pray for America banner. Let's pray together for God to make a difference in America. Point of View will continue after this. You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, is Kirby Anderson.
Back once again, Bodie Hodge with us as we talk about his book, Dinosaurs, Dragons, and the Bible. You can go to answersingenesis.org and find out a lot more. Many of you have probably been to the Creation Museum, the Ark Encounter, and if you would like to know more about this particular book, we have information about it on the website. Very inexpensive, given the fact that it has 25 chapters and is about 250 pages, so great material. But Bodie, just for a minute before we get back to dinosaurs, how many kinds of animals, including dinosaurs, were on the ark? You've had a chance to kind of think that through, run the numbers, and deal with not only with the animals, but the food and everything else over a one-year voyage of the ark. Can you explain kind of how you've worked out some of the numbers?
Sure. Well, I just want people to understand, it wasn't all me. I'm standing on the shoulders of giants on this. There have been people who have written technical articles and entire technical books on the subject. And then I got a chance to work with the ARC researchers as well. So, it was nice for me to kind of bring all that together, because the numbers out there, there have been times people said, oh, well, maybe there's about 1,000 different kinds. The ARC Encounter, when they did their study, they came with about 1,400 kinds. But that's not necessarily the same thing as the actual individuals. Like with the ARC Encounter, they tried to overestimate, try to maximize, just so that we're not being looked at by the world of, well, you're just trying to minimize them to fit them on the ark. So they were trying to kind of maximize. So with the 1,400 kinds, they have a maximum of just under 7,000 animals. Although without those maximum figures, it would probably be closer to about 3,200 individuals. So that just kind of gives you an idea, of that. But let's talk a little bit about kinds versus species, because a lot of people don't know what we mean when I say the word kind.
Yes.
Automatically people think species, and there's a massive number of species out there. But a species and a kind are not necessarily the same thing. Species comes out of our modern classification system, the Linnaean classification system. And just to give people an idea, when it comes to cats like lions and tigers and cheetahs and bobcats and house cats and so forth, they are all classed as different species, yet there's only one cat kind. All these cats can ultimately interbreed with each other. Some of the big cats can breed with the bobcats can breed with the house cats and so forth. So there's one kind. Now, notice what I had in there. If they can interbreed with each other, that's a good rule of thumb that they're part of the same kind. So Noah only required 2 cats on board the ark. He didn't require all these lions and cheetahs and tigers and so forth. He just needed two cats. The same sort of thing with the dinosaur kinds. You only needed 2 of each kind, not all the species. So when it comes to things like the ceratopsian dinosaurs, you got Triceratops and Torosaurus and Protoceratops. These are all just variations within that same ceratopsian kind. Noah only required 2 of the ceratopsians on board the ark. And so what that does, that brings us, when it comes to the dinosaur numbers, if you just look at those, the ark had a maximum of about 85 kinds, and the minimum number actually in that is about 36 kinds. So it translates to anywhere from about 72 to 170 individuals. But dinosaurs are a little different. And the reason I throw that range out there is because when it comes to cats or dogs, we can see what interbreeds with each other. When it comes to dinosaurs, well, they're not around anymore, so we can't really see. So we kind of have to do some estimates. We look at their bones and their structures and say, hey, are these part of the same kind or are they not? Based on that, what's called a cognitum level. Yeah. So that's where we get that range. Yeah.
Well, again, lots of great science, and I thought for just a few minutes then let's talk about Bible, because a lot of people say, okay, I don't see the word dinosaur in the Bible. Of course, you don't see the word mammal in the Bible either, but there is a sense in which this issue of dinosaurs and dragons come together, and I thought it would be good that since we've been doing a lot of science, be good for just a few minutes to maybe talk about Bible, because the way in which some of these translations dealt with these animals in the past didn't call them dinosaurs, but you have to begin to wonder if that's what they were alluding to. Can you kind of give us some history there?
Yeah, if you look throughout the Old Testament of the Bible, particularly a lot of the older translations, even in different languages, going all the way back to the Septuagint, which is about 200 and 250 years before Christ, the Latin Vulgate about AD 400, and you move forward, a lot of these early English translations or German translations, there was a word used there for several different Hebrew words, variant words, that is translated as dragon. Now, immediately you go, hold on, dragon's in the Bible? What? You got to be kidding me. Actually, it is in there. It's in there quite a few places. It's not one isolated book. It is all over the place. And these old translations had no problem translating it as dragon. And I want people to understand there's a connection between dinosaurs and dragons. And I would say even the world recognizes this, because when you look at some of the dinosaur names, there's a number of dinosaur names that actually use the word dragon. One of my favorite dinosaurs is called Dracorex hogwartsia.
Yes, I'm glad you used that. All the Hogwarts kids all of a sudden perked up because that actually is its name. Go ahead.
Yeah. Draco is the Latin word for dragon. And so,
and the second part, Hogwartsia, which that's where the idea of Hogwarts comes from. Anyway, it's just, I've got the picture in case you want to read it in the book. For all of you Harry Potter fans now, we're going to get into some pretty interesting things. And again, that goes back to even the kinds of names that have sometimes been given to some of these dinosaurs, which also use the word dragon. Go ahead.
Right, like Dragon of Kijong. Dracopelta, you can see the name dragon that's utilized in these different ones. And this is just a handful of them. There's quite a few. So even the secular world recognizes, hey, there is like a connection between dinosaurs and dragons. But we've all been taught dragons are myth. And what it is, the whole reason people thought dragons are myth is, well, they can't find them. And about the same time they couldn't find them, they're digging up these dinosaur bones and they give them a new name, dinosaur, which means terrifying or terrible lizard. And so for some reason, people just totally disconnected the two. But really, dinosaurs and dragons, there is a connection. Now, there is a difference. There is a distinction. Remember earlier, I made a comment about dinosaurs and the way they're defined. They're defined by their hip structure. Mm-hmm. So they have a particular hip structure that's under their body that raises their body up off the ground. So dinosaurs are land reptiles that have a specific hip structure. Now, when you look at dragon is more of an overarching term. It includes those dinosaurs, but it also includes creatures like crocodiles. It includes sea creatures like the plesiosaurs, or it also includes the flying reptiles like your pteranodons or pterodactyls. So dragon is more of an overarching term. So the way I like to put it is all dinosaurs could rightly be called a dragon, but not all the dragons could be called and defined as a dinosaur. So that's kind of an easy way to look at that. But yeah, dragons in the Bible. It's right there over and over again.
Well, let's explain this. I don't want to turn this into a Hebrew class for just a minute, but the Hebrew words that used to be translated as dragon are still there from Genesis all the way through Jeremiah. And I don't think people see that because we, of course, just read the English. But if you go back to the Hebrew words, it's referring to sea and land creatures of some sort. And at one time, that was actually defined as dragon. But then I think some well-meaning Christians, when they couldn't find evidence of dragons, said, well, then dragons are a myth, which they were making that statement at the very time that you had some of these great vertebrate paleontologists actually starting to dig up what today we call dinosaurs.
Yeah. Some of these Hebrew words, tanin, tanah, that's kind of a variation of that word tan. Throughout these old translations, nobody had a problem translating these as dragons. But you fast forward to the 1800s, that's when this all shifted.
Yes.
We don't find dragons anymore. And so, Christians are like, well, why are we translating this as dragon if they're not there? For some reason, a lot of these Christians were thinking that animals couldn't really go extinct. That was just, that just wasn't a concept. They just kept thinking, well, they must be living somewhere else. But when it came down to dragons, they're just like, well, maybe they're just a myth because we can't find them. And so now all of a sudden they're like, well, how do we translate this word now? You see, you get stuck in a conundrum. And so some people started using different animals. Some of them were even using plants. Sometimes they just skipped over it in the translation. It was very odd. And finally, a lot of them decided to start settling on wolf or jackal.
Yeah, jackal.
Now, there's another Hebrew word for jackal, but they didn't use that one. They kind of threw that one out and started using this word for dragon for jackal. And that's kind of the culture that we've been left with right now. But what we need to do is step back and go, hold on a second here. These creatures really were dragons, and most likely they've just gone extinct by the 1800s. So what we need to do is be a little more accurate, I think, with that particular word on our translations.
Sure. Well, let's take a break. When we come back, okay, well, then we can see a lot of places where it used to be especially in the Psalms, a number of times it talks about breaking the head of dragons and the young lion and the dragon and all the rest. But are there any places that seem to specifically mention dinosaurs? And those of you that have your Bible, you might turn to Job chapter 40, and we'll also look at Job chapter 41, and we'll get into that in just a minute. But it's all part of this book, Dinosaurs, Dragons, and the Bible. Bodie Hodge is the author. The book has been out for some time. It's a relatively inexpensive book, given the fact there's 25 chapters and about 250 pages of material. We are doing our best to give you a brief overview, but if you really want to learn more, of course, you need to get a copy of the book, and we have information about that on our website, and we'll be right back.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, talking with Bodie Hodge about his book, Dinosaurs, Dragons, and the Bible. And that brings us to, of course, are dinosaurs mentioned in the Bible? And oftentimes I get that question, and I say, well, okay, turn to Job 40. It talks about this particular behemoth actually eats grass like an ox, and its strength is in his loins. And they say, oh, it's an elephant. I said, next verse says, he swings his tail like a cedar. And then I say, think of an elephant's tail. And I usually get a laugh when I do that, because if anybody's seen an elephant's tail or the tail of a hippo, you have those pictures in your book. It doesn't exactly swing its tail like a cedar. So what about this particular animal mentioned in Job 40?
Yeah, well, this creature, when you look carefully at that description, it doesn't match an elephant, doesn't match a hippo. And I think sometimes people are just looking at some large, massive creatures today because, the Bible talks about this being, the first or the chief of the ways of God, So, I mean, they're thinking, hey, this has got to be some sort of massive creature. And they're not thinking of potentially extinct creatures when they make those little comments. When you look carefully at some of these details in here, I mean, this thing, he goes in, he's in the water, he's in the reeds, and the lotus trees hardly give it shade. I mean, it's some sort of massive creature, yet it can migrate all the way to the mountains and plays there. So you look at the tail, you look at the hip structure. This is some sort of unique creature. It actually fits a creature a little bit more akin to something like a sauropod, especially when you look at that particular tail. And so I think, hey, this is a good possibility of being some sort of a dinosaur-like creature. I think it makes a lot more sense of the context anyway.
Well, then in Job 41, you have this idea of Leviathan. And again, there's sometimes a tendency to say, well, that's probably a crocodile or an alligator or something like that. And then it talks about fire and flames from its mouth and breath sets coals ablaze. That sounds a lot more like a dragon than it does like a alligator or crocodile or caiman or something like that.
Sure, yeah. Some of the other description given there in Job 41, darts and spears cannot pierce it. Yeah, we think of a crocodile. It's like, well, yeah, people shoot those, or spear those all the time, going back through the past. So it's definitely a unique creature. Once again, it comes down to that context. And we're faced with this reality of, hey, there are some creatures that are no longer around for us to compare them to. But we've been digging up all these different fossils. And so, there's a lot of candidates for this sort of thing that actually fits these descriptions much, much better. I know with Leviathan, a number of people have thrown out different ideas because this is a water creature. And, I know some people have thrown out plesiosaur, some people have thrown out Chronosaurus.
Yeah.
It might even be a creature that we don't know. But it's definitely some sort of massive creature that you did not want to mess with. There's no doubt about that one.
For sure. Well, let's talk about the fact that in history, in art, in these petroglyphs, I know you have those at the Creation Museum. Just a few miles from where I'm broadcasting is the Institute for Creation Research. And if you go through their particular Creation Museum, they have a whole wall, and it's just picture after picture of things that look like dinosaurs that are taken from places all over the world. Some of them are in China and Asia. Some of them are in Africa. You have all sorts of places around the world that are showing pictures, drawing pictures, having stories about something that looks like dragons. Is that a possibility that those were indeed dinosaurs that got off the ark, existed for a period of time, but eventually went extinct? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, you know what? I think that makes the most sense. A lot of creatures have gone extinct. Imagine how many animals would be extinct if we wouldn't have enacted the endangered species list in 1973. We probably wouldn't have lions and tigers and elephants and hippos and rhinos and condors and eagles. I mean, the list goes on and on. We're just sitting here wondering, hey, are those things a myth? Did they even exist? But it's the same sort of thing. When we look at these different creatures from all around the world, these are people who saw something and wrote it down or described it, or they actually have a drawn-up description of it. And I've seen these things in places all over. When I was down in Peru and South America, we go to these museums and we'd see pottery and art and different things that had dinosaur dragon-like depictions on it. When I was over in the British Museum over in England, I was surprised at how many ancient things had dragons on it right there alongside other creatures that you'd readily recognize. So I have no doubt these people were seeing creatures that definitely looked like some of the dinosaurs that we depict.
You have a section in the back on short answers to common dinosaur questions and everything from what about the Loch Ness Monster to whatever. But I wanted to focus on one because a lot of people say, well, I'm glad you believe in a young Earth, but everything is old. But we're finding dinosaur soft tissue, and that is not something that you're making up. It's something that's been in the news for some time. And to have soft tissue from something that supposedly went extinct hundreds of millions of years ago does raise some really important questions, doesn't it?
Yeah, it sure does. And what I loved about that is it was the secularists that found that. Dr. Mary Schweitzer was the first one. They cracked open a T-Rex femur, and they get back to the lab, and they start looking where they cracked it open, and they found some preserved red blood cells. And since then, they've cracked open others. And I know some creationists that cracked open a Triceratops horn, and they found some soft tissue. Some of it stretchy. It gave off an odor. I mean, that makes so much more sense that it's a matter of thousands of years old as opposed to, say, millions and millions of years old. Just makes a lot more sense.
Let's, if we can, just real quickly talk about how people can use this, because, first of all, in addition to this book are other resources at Answers in Genesis, and there's some things that you've written and Ken Ham have written and some others. So let's, if we can, just before we run out of time, talk about the fact that if people go to this wonderful website, which is entitled AnswersInGenesis.org, there is a lot of information about archaeology, apologetics, science, history, philosophy, and all of that is available to individuals that want to get the resources, maybe even subscribe to the newsletter that you have. So just before we go, talk about all the other resources that are available in addition to this book, Dinosaurs, Dragons, and the Bible.
Right. Well, there's a host of books there in the bookstore, and of course the website has a lot of information as well. But I want to encourage people to come to the Creation Museum and come to the Ark Encounter. Here in northern Kentucky, in the Cincinnati area. We're actually fairly close to the Cincinnati Northern Kentucky Airport, both attractions. And you'll find a host of resources in the bookstores as well. But it really is a way to kind of walk through Bible history, walk through the Ark, get a chance to actually learn about these things firsthand. Some of the questions you didn't even think of when you're walking through the Ark, for example. And then load up on the resources. There's books, there's DVDs. We also have Answers.tv. Which have thousands of our videos and different things. We've got stuff from Ray Comfort, many others as well on Answers TV. And there's a great way to learn and just grow in your faith from these different resources.
Well, Bodie, first of all, I want to thank you for writing the book. Thank you for giving us an hour today. And thank you for being the one that so often is trying to answer all those questions that I'm sure you get from the young people walking to the Ark Encounter and wondering how in the world all of this came together. So I appreciate you giving us some time today to talk about your book and to talk about what is available at Answers in Genesis.
You bet. God bless you. Keep up the great work.
Let's, just before we run out of time, mention that again, we have the AnswersInGenesis.org website. There is an Ultimate Answers packet that is available, which you can find. If you find yourself saying, well, I'd like to know more about dragons, they also have an interactive book that is full of biblical and historical references to dragons called Dragons, Legends, Lore, and Dinosaurs. And of course, it's this book, Dinosaurs, Dragons, and the Bible. These are individuals that we've seen on the big screen in all sorts of movies like Jurassic Park and Jurassic zoos and things of that nature. It is something that is fascinating. And we thought it would be a good opportunity for you to learn a little bit more about dinosaurs, dragons, and the Bible, because indeed there may be very good answers to those questions that maybe your children and grandchildren are asking. Maybe you're asking. And thank you for listening. You've been listening to Point of View.
It almost seems like we live in a different world from many people in positions of authority. They say men can be women and women men. People are prosecuted differently or not at all, depending on their politics. Criminals are more valued and rewarded than law-abiding citizens. It's so overwhelming, so demoralizing. You feel like giving up, but we can't. We shouldn't. We must not. As Winston Churchill said to Britain in the darkest days of World War II, never give in, never give in, never, 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 never yield to force, never yield to the apparently overwhelming might of the enemy. And that's what we say to you today. This is not a time to give in, but to step up and join Point of View in providing clarity in the chaos. We can't do it alone, but together, with God's help, we will overcome the darkness. Invest in biblical clarity today at pointofview.net or call 1-800-347-5151. Pointofview.net and 800-347-5151. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.